His Christmas mail-order bride arrives with a hidden talent that saves his struggling ranch. When lonely rancher Frank Miller's faith is fading, a mysterious bride named Hope appears on Christmas Eve, with a secret gift that revives his dying ranch and restores his soul. A story of redemption, love, and faith in the harsh Wyoming winter. Wyoming Territory, 1887, a stormy Christmas Eve. The Miller Ranch sits miles from the nearest town, buried under a blanket of white silence. The wind screamed through the gaps in the cabin walls, rattling the loose shutters like the knuckles of a ghost. Inside, Frank Miller sat hunched over the dying fire, his calloused hands pressed together in silent prayer. The warmth barely touched his skin anymore. The ranch had once been his pride, the proof that hard work and faith could tame even the wildest frontier. But after 2 brutal winters, disease among his cattle, and a failed harvest, the land had turned against him. Now, only a few weak cows huddled in the barn, and Frank wondered if the Lord himself had turned away. He stared at the faded photograph on the mantel, a younger version of himself beside his late parents. They had believed in Christmas miracles. He wasn't sure he did anymore. Frank rose and walked to the frosted window, peering into the storm. Snow swirled like smoke, hiding the fences and the distant hills. "Lord," he muttered, voice rough with weariness, "I've done all I can. If you still remember me, if you still got reason for me to keep this place, just give me a sign. Something." The room fell silent except for the pop of a burning log. His gaze shifted to the small Bible on the table, its cover cracked, pages yellowed. He hadn't opened it in months, not since the bank notice arrived. But now, with nothing left to lose, he reached for it. The Bible fell open to Isaiah 43 verse 2. "When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee." He read the words twice, a lump forming in his throat. It was almost enough to make him believe again. Almost. Then, a sound broke the silence. A faint, hesitant knock at the door. Frank froze. Out here miles from town, no one came calling in a storm. Another knock followed, this one firmer, urgent but polite. He grabbed his lantern and crossed the floor, boots heavy against the wooden boards. "Who's there?" he called, voice echoing in the wind. "Hope Abbott," came a woman's voice, soft, tremulous but steady. "From the Boston Matrimonial Agency." Her words caught on the cold. "I'm your bride, Mr. Miller." Frank's breath caught. Bride. His heart gave a painful thud. Months ago, in a moment of desperation and loneliness, he had written to that agency, but he'd never sent payment. He'd given up on the idea the same week he lost his best mare. He swung open the door and snow blasted in, swirling around a small figure clutching a worn leather suitcase. She was wrapped in a tattered gray shawl, her bonnet dusted with frost, cheeks flushed pink from the cold. Her blue eyes, wide, uncertain yet unyielding, met his. "You shouldn't be out in this," Frank said gruffly, pulling her inside. "The pass is near impassable. How'd you make it here?" "I walked the last few miles after the coach broke down," she replied, voice trembling as she pressed her gloved hands to the fire. "They said your ranch was just ahead." She hesitated, glancing at him shyly. "I was afraid I'd come too late." Frank took her coat, heavy with ice. "Too late for what, Miss Abbott?" Her eyes softened. "Too late for you to still want a wife." He stared at her, this small, determined woman who had braved a blizzard just to find him. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice thick, "you're either brave or out of your mind. But since you came this far, you best stay the night." She smiled faintly, relief washing over her face. "Then I'll stay, Mr. Miller." "Thank you." As she unpacked her meager belongings, a Bible, a hairbrush, and a tin box of sewing needles, Frank watched from the corner of the room, unsure what to make of her. She was not what he expected. Younger, yes, but something about her seemed older inside. Worn but not broken. She moved to the hearth, rekindling the fire with a skill that surprised him. "You've been letting the flame die," she murmured. "I've been letting everything die," he muttered under his breath. But she heard him. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes catching the flicker of light. "Then maybe I came just in time." Outside, the wind wailed like the cry of a soul lost in the snow. But inside the cabin, for the first time in months, the warmth returned, not from the fire, but from the quiet presence of a woman who carried hope in her name, and perhaps something more in her heart. Frank sat down across from her, still wary but unable to look away. He didn't know it yet, but the storm had brought not just a stranger to his door, but the answer to his prayer. And before the night was through, that prayer would begin to change everything. The morning after Christmas Eve, Frank's ranch, the snowstorm easing, sunlight faintly breaking through the clouds. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shuttered window, touching the dust that hung in the air like a golden mist. Frank woke to the smell of food, real food, and for a moment he thought he was dreaming. He pushed off the heavy quilt and rubbed his eyes. The fire was already roaring in the hearth. On the small table, a skillet of corn cake sizzled, and the scent of hot coffee filled the room. He hadn't tasted coffee in weeks. Hope Abbott stood near the stove, sleeves rolled up, her hair coming loose from its braid. She was humming softly, her voice warm and steady, a hymn he hadn't heard since his mother died, "Come thou fount of every blessing." Frank cleared his throat. "You're up early." She turned, startled but smiling. "Old habit. I used to rise before the children at the schoolhouse. Hard to stop now." He blinked. "Schoolhouse. I was a teacher in Kansas City before I came here." Her voice softened, and she flipped a corn cake with quiet precision. "I didn't have much left to stay for." Frank hesitated. He wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her tone warned him off. Instead he nodded toward the food. "You didn't have to do all this." She smiled faintly. "If I didn't, we'd both freeze and starve before New Year's." That earned her a short, grudging laugh. It felt strange, the sound of laughter in that cabin. It startled even him. They sat across from each other, the fire crackling between them. Hope bowed her head and prayed before eating, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank watched her lips move, soft, reverent, and something stirred in him that had been dormant for too long. When she finished, he finally said, "You came a long way for a man who didn't send for you." She met his gaze steadily. "I know you didn't send the payment. The agency told me. But I read your letter." "My letter?" he asked, frowning. She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded a creased piece of paper. "You wrote that you'd lost more than cattle. That you'd lost your faith, that you were tired of being alone, but didn't know if love had any place left in your life." He flushed, the words echoing his own shame. "That was supposed to be private." "It was honest," she said gently. "And that's why I came. I didn't want money. I wanted purpose again. Maybe God thought we both needed saving." Frank didn't reply. He wasn't used to talking about God anymore, not since the drought and the deaths of his livestock had stripped away everything he believed in. After breakfast they went outside together. The storm had passed, leaving the world glittering in sunlight. The air was sharp and cold, their breath forming small clouds as they walked to the barn. Inside, the few surviving cows shivered under patched blankets. The roof leaked in 2 places and one of the animals lay weakly on the straw. "You still have a few left," Hope murmured, crouching beside the sickly cow. "She's burning up." Frank sighed. "Caught fever 2 weeks ago. Ain't got the money for the vet. Been trying to keep her warm, but—" He trailed off, frustration in every word. Hope laid her palm on the cow's head, eyes closing as if in silent prayer. "Sometimes," she said softly, "warmth and a little care go further than coin." Frank studied her, this delicate woman who had walked through a blizzard to reach a broken man's ranch, now kneeling in the straw without hesitation. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. She smiled without looking up. "Neither are you, Mr. Miller." Later that day they rode into town to register their marriage, a formality Hope insisted upon. The townsfolk stared as the pair entered the small courthouse, a weary rancher beside a woman no one had seen before. "Mail-order bride, eh?" a man at the counter muttered. "Poor gal don't know what she's gettin' into." Frank's jaw tightened, but Hope's eyes sparkled with quiet confidence. "A woman's worth," she said clearly, "isn't found in what a man owns but in what they can build together." The room went still. The clerk blushed and stammered his way through the paperwork. When they left, Frank helped her onto his horse and said with a faint smile, "You talk mighty bold for someone who just met me." "Faith makes you bold," she replied. "You'll learn that again soon." That night, back at the cabin, she warmed her hands by the fire while Frank mended a broken chair leg. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was gentle, almost peaceful. Finally she spoke. "I didn't come here to be kept. I came to help. If you'll let me." He glanced up, her words echoing through the quiet. "Help?" "Yes," she said. "I've seen worse than this ranch. A place can be healed, Mr. Miller, if the people on it still believe it's worth saving." Her voice carried the steady conviction of someone who had been through darkness and still found her way back to light. Frank didn't know it then, but those words would become the seed of every change to come, the spark that would turn ruin into renewal. And as he banked the fire and watched her settle into the small cot by the hearth, he found himself whispering into the quiet. Maybe, just maybe, God ain't done with me yet. The following week, the storm has cleared, revealing the cold beauty of Wyoming's winter plains. Life at Miller Ranch begins to show faint signs of change. The days after Christmas passed in a quiet rhythm that neither Frank nor Hope expected. Each morning, Frank rose before dawn, stepping out into the crisp white world while Hope kindled the fire and prepared breakfast. The cabin, once silent and hollow, now held the hum of life, the smell of bread baking, the creak of floorboards, the low murmur of two people learning to share space. Frank found himself listening for her voice, the way she hummed as she worked, her songs carrying across the snow like small prayers. He told himself it was just gratitude, someone to cook, to care for the place, but deep down, something was thawing that he hadn't felt in years. One morning he found her out in the barn, sleeves rolled up, her skirt dusted with straw. She was leaning over one of the sick cows, whispering softly while she rubbed something into its side, a mixture that smelled faintly of mint and pine. "What's that?" Frank asked, stepping inside. She looked up, startled, then smiled. "A tonic I make myself. I learned it from a healer I knew in Kansas. It helps with fever and infection." Frank frowned slightly, watching her work with surprising confidence. "You sure know a lot for a schoolteacher." She paused, her hands still. "I wasn't always a teacher. Before that, I worked with a doctor. He taught me more than just medicine. He taught me that everything can heal, given enough care." Her eyes flicked up to his. "Even people." He shifted uncomfortably, his heart caught off guard. "You think that applies to ranches too?" "Especially ranches," she said softly, brushing the cow's neck. "They breathe, they suffer, and they recover, just like us." That afternoon, Hope offered to ride with him into Sweetwater, the nearest town. Frank hesitated but agreed. He needed supplies and she wanted to register herself as a local resident. The journey was quiet at first, their horses' hooves crunching through the snow. But as they approached town, Hope straightened her shawl, and Frank noticed a flicker of tension in her face. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "Just, haven't been among people in a while." When they entered the general store, heads turned. The townsfolk knew Frank, once respected, now pitted. His ranch's decline had been the talk of the valley for months. But the woman beside him, polite, gentle, radiant in her humility, drew stares for another reason. "That Miller?" whispered Mrs. Dodd, the storekeeper's wife. "Didn't think he had it in him to marry again." "Mail-order bride," muttered another woman behind a barrel of flour. "She'll be gone by spring." Hope's face flushed, but she said nothing. Instead, she picked up a small bundle of fabric and turned to Frank with a steady smile. "This color suits the curtains, don't you think?" Her calmness silenced the whispers. Even the storekeeper looked uneasy. As they left, Frank could feel the anger burning in his chest. "You shouldn't have to hear talk like that." Hope mounted the horse, glancing toward the snowy mountains in the distance. "People talk because they don't understand what faith looks like when it's still building." He looked at her curiously. "And what's faith look like then?" She smiled faintly. "It looks like a man still trying even after everyone stopped believing he can." Frank had no reply. That evening, as they unpacked their things, Hope grew quiet. She stood by the window, gazing out over the moonlit pasture. Frank watched her, sensing something unspoken weighing on her. "You haven't told me much about your past," he said carefully. "About Kansas." She didn't turn. "Not much to tell." "I think there's more," he said gently. Her hands tightened on the windowsill. "I left because I had to." The man who ran the town. He fancied himself a God-fearing businessman, but he had no mercy. "When my father died, he came after our home. Said I could keep it if I agreed to be his wife." Frank's jaw clenched. "Did you?" "I refused." She turned then, eyes glistening but fierce. "So he made sure I lost everything. My position. My reputation. I was unwanted." Silence filled the cabin, heavy and sacred. Frank swallowed hard. "You walked through a blizzard to start over with a stranger just because you read a letter." She nodded. "Because your letter spoke of loss, not bitterness. And I knew, any man who still prayed even through doubt wasn't truly lost." He lowered his gaze, his throat tightening. "I'm not sure about that anymore." "Then I'll believe enough for both of us," she said softly. Later that night, Frank found her asleep by the fire, her hands folded on her lap, her Bible resting open beside her. He picked it up gently, reading the underlined verse. "Behold, I make all things new." Revelation 21 verse 5. He looked at her, this woman who'd crossed the wilderness to reach him, who carried pain and peace in equal measure, and felt something stir inside him, something long buried beneath years of failure and solitude. Maybe she wasn't just a mail-order bride. Maybe she was the answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to voice. Outside, the snow began to fall again, slow and quiet. Inside, for the first time in years, Frank Miller whispered the one word that no longer felt foreign on his tongue. Hope. Late winter 1888, Wyoming plains. Snow still clings to the edges of the Miller Ranch, but beneath it, change is quietly stirring. The morning sun rose like a thin gold thread over the white horizon. Frank stepped outside, bracing against the cold wind. He expected the same quiet stillness he'd grown used to, a dead, heavy silence that had haunted his ranch for months. But today he heard something new. Movement. Voices. The sound of buckets clanging. He followed it to the barn and stopped short in the doorway. Hope Abbott, his wife by law if not yet in heart, was working like she'd lived there her whole life. Her coat hung on a nail, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her hair had come undone from its braid. She moved quickly but gently, humming as she mixed something in a tin bowl. A sick cow lay nearby, the same one he'd nearly given up on. The animal's eyes were half closed, but its breathing, once shallow and weak, had grown stronger. "What on earth are you doing, Hope?" he asked, half in awe, half in disbelief. "Saving your herd," she said without looking up. "These cows aren't dying of plague. They've been eating moldy hay. I found it in the bottom of your storage shed." Frank frowned. "Mold? I've been feeding that to them all winter." She nodded grimly. "It's a common mistake. The damp from the roof spoils the lower bales. I saw it in Kansas too." Hope dipped a rag into the bowl and began to rub the animal's side. The smell of pine, garlic, and something sharp filled the barn. "What's in that?" he asked, crouching beside her. "Juniper oil, vinegar, and salt," she replied. "It draws out fever. I made it from what I found in your pantry. You'd be surprised what cures God hides in the simplest things." He stared at her hands, small, sure, and unafraid. "You've done this before." She smiled faintly. "I told you I worked with a healer once. When the railroad came through Kansas, half the livestock fell sick. I learned what I could because someone had to." For the next several days, Frank watched her work, disbelief slowly turning into admiration. She rose before dawn, checking each animal, mixing herbal tonics, cleaning the stalls. She mended torn saddles and patched the barn roof with burlap and tar, humming hymns under her breath. When Frank tried to stop her, "You'll wear yourself out," she only smiled and said, "I've been tired before, Mr. Miller. This kind of tired feels good." By the end of the week, the change was undeniable. The cattle stood taller, their coats shining. The weak calves began to feed again. Frank stood at the barn door one evening, watching as the sunset poured through the cracks in the wood, casting golden light over Hope's face. "I don't rightly understand how you did it," he said quietly. Hope smiled without turning. "Sometimes healing doesn't start with the body. It starts when someone believes things can be fixed again." Frank's throat tightened. "You mean me?" "I mean both of us," she said softly. That Sunday they rode into town to attend church for the first time together. Frank hadn't stepped inside that chapel in nearly 2 years, not since the winter his herd had died and his prayers had gone unanswered. When he walked in beside Hope, heads turned again, but this time the whispers were different. "Is that Miller? Looks like the man's got some life back in him. I heard his herd's recovering. That woman must be a blessing." Hope pretended not to hear, but Frank saw her shoulders ease with quiet relief. During the sermon, Pastor Reynolds spoke of renewal and grace, his words echoing the very lessons Frank had begun to learn again at home. After the service, several townsfolk approached, curious about Hope's work. A farmer named Ellis asked timidly if she might take a look at his lame horse. Hope hesitated, glancing at Frank. He nodded. "You should go. The man's desperate." They followed Ellis to his homestead the next day. The horse's leg was swollen and stiff, and Ellis's wife had tears in her eyes. Hope knelt beside the animal, examined the wound, and set to work with her steady hands. She wrapped it with a cloth soaked in one of her mixtures, murmuring to the frightened creature all the while. "You talk to animals now?" Frank teased lightly. "They listen better than most men," she replied with a smirk. By week's end, Ellis's horse was walking again. Word spread fast, "The rancher's bride has healing hands." Soon, neighbors began arriving at the Miller place with their sick animals, cows, mules, even dogs. Hope helped each one, never asking for payment. People brought what they could: flour, oats, a plank of wood to patch the porch. And just like that, what had been a dying ranch became a place of hope. One evening, as twilight fell over the hills, Frank found her sitting on the fence, watching the herd graze in the dim light. He joined her, silence stretching between them like an old, comfortable blanket. "You've changed this place," he said finally. She looked at him, her face glowing in the amber light. "No, Frank. You changed it when you let me try." He studied her for a long moment. "You're different, Hope. You carry light where there shouldn't be any." Her voice softened. "Maybe I just refuse to live without it." A gust of cold wind swept across the plains, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Frank reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You know," he said quietly, "when you showed up that night I thought you were crazy." She laughed, a warm, gentle sound that filled the air. "Maybe I am. But sometimes crazy is what faith looks like before the miracle." Frank smiled, something deep inside him shifting. He didn't say it aloud, but for the first time in years he believed her. Early spring 1888. The snow has begun to melt, revealing green pastures beneath. Life is returning to the Miller Ranch and with it, hope. The winter's frost loosened its grip on the land, and the Miller Ranch began to breathe again. The air, once dry and bitter, carried the scent of thawing earth and pine. Tiny shoots of grass poked through the snowdrifts like timid signs of a promise kept. Frank stood by the corral watching his cattle, healthier now than they'd been in a year, graze contentedly under the morning sun. The weak calf that Hope had nursed back to life bounded clumsily between its mother's legs. Hope stepped out of the barn, wiping her hands on her apron, her cheeks flushed from work. She'd been up since dawn, tending to a neighbor's mule that had thrown a shoe and nearly lamed itself. "You're going to wear yourself out, woman?" Frank said with a half smile, leaning on the fence. Hope gave him that look, soft but stubborn. "If the Lord didn't mean for me to use my hands, he wouldn't have given me two of them." He chuckled. "You always got an answer, don't you?" "Only when you need one," she said, her smile turning playful. That afternoon a wagon rattled up the trail, a family from a neighboring ranch. Their young son sat in the back, pale and shivering, his arm wrapped tight in a bloodied bandage. Frank went to meet them. "Trouble?" The boy's mother looked distraught. "He fell on the fence wire yesterday. The doctor's 20 miles away and the wound's gone bad. They said your wife knows healing." Hope was already coming down the porch steps, her apron fluttering in the wind. "Bring him inside." Frank watched in quiet amazement as she cleaned and dressed the boy's wound with calm precision. She murmured prayers as she worked, her hands gentle but confident. When she finished, she pressed the mother's hand. "Keep it clean and change the wrap daily. He'll heal fine by God's grace." Tears filled the woman's eyes. "How can we ever thank you?" Hope smiled. "Help someone else when they're in need. That's thanks enough." As the wagon rolled away, Frank leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "You know you could charge for that. Folks pay good money for what you do." Hope shook her head. "The moment I do it for profit, it stops being a gift. This isn't my power, it's his." Frank looked down humbled. He'd always measured worth in cattle and acres, not in kindness and mercy. Yet here she was, rebuilding not just his ranch but his soul. In the weeks that followed, people from all around Sweetwater came to the Miller Ranch. A man brought his horse with a split hoof. A widow brought her sick cow. Someone even came with a basket of chickens that refused to lay eggs. Hope tended to them all with patience and joy. The townsfolk, once skeptical of her, began to speak her name with respect. Hope Miller, they called her now. The woman who could make the land itself breathe again. Even Pastor Reynolds visited one evening, bringing with him a loaf of bread and a smile. "You've done what sermons couldn't, Mrs. Miller. You've turned despair into faith." Hope only smiled. "Faith was already here, Pastor. It was just buried under snow." Frank repaired the barn that spring, hammering new beams into place while Hope painted the porch white. They worked side by side, sweat and laughter mixing with the sound of hammers and wind. Sometimes she sang while she worked, old hymns from her childhood, and he'd pause just to listen. But one night as they sat together by the fire, she grew quiet. The shadows danced across her face, and her hands twisted the hem of her skirt. "Frank," she said softly, "there's something I should have told you sooner." He looked up from his chair, instantly alert. "What is it?" Her voice trembled. "Back in Kansas, I left in the middle of the night. The man who tried to force me into marriage, he's still alive. I don't know if he'd ever come after me, but—" She trailed off, eyes shining with fear she'd never shown before. Frank stood and came to her side, his rough hand closing around hers. "Hope, listen to me. No one's talking you from here. Not now, not ever." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "You don't know what he's capable of." "I know what God's capable of," Frank said firmly. And I've seen what you can do with nothing but faith and a handful of herbs. If that man comes, he'll find a husband, and a God he can't fight." Hope's lips trembled, then curved into a small, trembling smile. "You mean that?" "With every breath I've got." He pulled her close, and for the first time she didn't resist. Her head rested against his chest, and he realized how natural it felt, how right. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the stars shimmered like lanterns over the wide Wyoming sky. Over the following days, Frank began to notice something beyond the mended fences and healed animals. Hope's presence had changed the feel of the ranch itself. Where despair had once hung heavy, laughter now echoed. The barn smelled of hay and clean earth instead of sickness. Even the birds seemed to return earlier that year. Frank had long believed his land was cursed, doomed by failure and fate. But as he watched Hope move through the yard, her shawl trailing in the breeze, he realized something profound. She hadn't just saved his ranch. She'd saved him. That Sunday, Hope placed a hand-carved wooden sign by the front gate. The words were simple, burned into the grain by Frank's careful hand. "Hope's Haven." She smiled when she saw it. "You named it after me?" He shook his head. "No. I named it after what you brought back." She looked out over the land, the fields reborn, the cattle healthy, the sky endless and blue. "Then let's make sure it stays worthy of the name." Frank took her hand, the calluses of a working man pressing against the softness of a healer's touch. "As long as you're here, it will." And as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting a golden glow over the land that had once known only ruin, Frank Miller finally understood. Sometimes God's greatest miracles walk to your door in the middle of a storm and never leave again. 1 year later, Christmas Eve 1888. The Miller Ranch is blanketed in snow once again, but this time the storm brings warmth instead of fear. Snow drifted down in slow, silent flakes, softening every sound on the Miller Ranch. The fences, the roof, even the old barn seemed dressed in white lace. A year ago, Frank Miller had stood in this same yard feeling broken, lost, and ready to give up. Now, laughter echoed through the house like a hymn. Inside, the smell of pine and cinnamon filled the air. A small cedar tree stood near the hearth, its branches hung with ribbons, dried apples, and the faint sparkle of candlelight. Hope had insisted they make it themselves, saying, "A Christmas tree should hold the touch of the hands that love it." Frank sat by the fire, carving something from a block of cedar while Hope kneaded bread at the table. Her hair had come loose from its bun, a few strands glowing gold in the lamplight. Every few minutes she'd glance his way, smiling softly when she caught him watching. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Frank looked up from his carving. "Storm's comin' again," he murmured. Hope smiled faintly, her hands stilling on the dough. Last Christmas brought a storm too, and a stranger who'd nearly lost his faith. Frank's lips twitched into a grin. And a mail-order bride who saved his ranch with nothing but courage, kindness, and a lot of stubbornness. Hope laughed, her eyes bright. "I'd say it took both of us." That night, just as they sat down to supper, a frantic knocking came at the door. Frank rose at once, pulling it open to reveal 2 ranch hands from the neighboring property, faces red from cold, breath steaming in the air. "Frank?" one of them gasped. "A wagon went off the road on the north trail. We can't move it, there's a woman and her boy trapped inside." Hope didn't hesitate. She grabbed her shawl and a lantern. "Let's go," she said, already pulling on her boots. Frank frowned. "It's near whiteout conditions, Hope. It's too dangerous." She met his eyes firmly. "You didn't think I'd let someone freeze on Christmas Eve, did you?" There was no arguing with her when her eyes had that fire. Frank threw on his coat and followed. The trail was nearly invisible under the swirling snow. Lanterns bobbed through the dark as they trudged forward, the wind cutting through their coats like knives. At last they found the wagon half buried near the creek, its wheels snapped and the horse trembling with exhaustion. Inside were a woman and a young boy, huddled together under a torn blanket. "Ma'am," Hope called gently, brushing snow off the canvas. "We're here to help." The woman looked up, eyes wide with fear and relief. "My boy's hurt, the wagon tipped when we hit the ditch." Hope climbed inside without hesitation, examining the boy's leg. Blood had frozen around a jagged cut. She pressed her shawl to the wound. "Frank, we need to get them back quick." Frank nodded, hoisting the boy into his arms while the woman stumbled beside them. They made the slow journey home through the snow, the lantern light barely piercing the storm. Back at the ranch, Hope worked with steady hands beside the fire, washing the boy's wound and wrapping it in clean linen. The mother wept quietly at the table, whispering prayers between sobs. Frank brought them broth and blankets, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. "You're safe here," he said. "We'll see to it." When the boy finally fell asleep, Hope sat back, exhaustion washing over her. Frank knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've done it again," he said softly. "Saved another soul." She shook her head, smiling faintly. "Not me. Christmas doing what it always does, reminding us who we are." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw the woman who had walked into his life through a storm 1 year ago. The woman who'd turned his house into a home, his despair into faith. And before he could stop himself, he reached for her hand. "Hope," he said, his voice thick, "you came to me as a mail-order bride I didn't deserve. But you've become the answer to every prayer I ever whispered." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "And you, Frank Miller, were the home I didn't know I needed." He pulled something from his pocket, a small cedar carving, smooth and pale. It was a cross, delicate but strong, the grain running straight and true. "I made this for you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "To hang above the hearth. Not just to remember what we've been through, but what's ahead." Hope took it with trembling fingers, her lips parting in awe. "It's beautiful. Not as beautiful as what you've built here," he said softly. "This ranch, this life." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the storm. Then Hope leaned in and kissed him, slow, warm and sure. A kiss that tasted of new beginnings and promises kept. Later that night, as the storm quieted, they stood together at the doorway, looking out across the moonlit snow. The stars shone brighter than they had in years. Hope's voice was barely a whisper. "Do you think the Lord still works miracles?" Frank smiled, his arms slipping around her shoulders. "You're standin' in one." She laughed softly, leaning into him. "Merry Christmas, Frank." He kissed the top of her head. "Merry Christmas, Hope." Inside, the cedar cross hung above the hearth, glowing gently in the firelight. And in that small ranch house, once filled with loneliness but now rich with love, Christmas came not with thunder or angels, but in the quiet way of all true miracles, through two people who had finally found faith in each other. 1 year later, Christmas Day 1889. The Miller Ranch has become a place of gathering, healing, and renewal for the people of Sweetwater Valley. The morning dawned crisp and bright, the snow glittering like powdered glass across the fields. The Miller Ranch, now proudly called Hope's Haven, stood strong against the horizon, smoke curling from its chimney, a beacon of warmth in the winter cold. Inside, the house was alive with the sounds of life. Children's laughter echoed through the hall, boots clattered against the floorboards, and voices filled the air with cheer. The townsfolk of Sweetwater had gathered for a Christmas service, the first ever held on the Miller Ranch. Frank adjusted his Sunday jacket, feeling slightly uncomfortable in it. He wasn't used to so many people in his home. But seeing their faces, neighbors who once pitted him, ranchers who now came to him for advice, widows Hope had helped, he couldn't help but smile. Hope moved gracefully among them, her simple blue dress catching the sunlight from the window. She carried a basket of biscuits, her laughter warm and unguarded. When she passed Frank, she touched his arm gently, her eyes shining with the joy of a woman who had found her purpose. "You nervous?" she teased. He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Ain't every day a man hosts half the county for Christmas?" She grinned. "It's not your doing, it's God's. We just opened the door." When everyone had gathered in the barn, now decorated with garlands of pine, handmade candles, and wooden benches, Pastor Reynolds stood at the front, Bible in hand. Behind him, a wooden plaque hung proudly on the wall. Read, "Hope's Haven, where the weary find rest." The pastor smiled at the crowd. "A year ago, I stood before a small congregation and prayed for mercy upon a land that had lost its way. Today I stand before living proof that prayer still works. The Miller Ranch has become more than a home, it's become a testimony." He turned toward Hope and Frank, his eyes glistening. "Through their faith, this valley has found new life." Applause rippled through the room and Hope lowered her head shyly. Frank squeezed her hand. The pastor continued, "This Christmas, we're reminded that God's gifts seldom arrive in the packages we expect. Sometimes they come as storms, as struggles, and sometimes they come as people, sent to heal what was broken." He closed his Bible, and the room fell silent except for the soft crackle of the fire. Let us give thanks for that gift today. For love that restores, for faith that endures, and for hope that never dies. As the service ended, music began to fill the air, fiddles, harmonicas, and voices rising in song. Hope's Haven came alive with celebration. Children danced near the fire, the men shared coffee and stories, and the women passed around plates of sweet bread and stew. Frank stood by the doorway looking out over the snowy valley. He could see the fences mended, the cattle healthy, and the fields stretching wide under the winter sun. It was a sight that used to make him feel small and beaten. Now it filled him with peace. Hope joined him, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "They're calling for you," she said, nodding toward the barn. "They want you to say something." He frowned slightly. "Me? I ain't no speaker." "Neither was Moses," she said with a gentle smile. Frank hesitated, then sighed and walked to the center of the barn. The crowd quieted as he looked around, his hat in his hands. He began awkwardly, "never figured I'd have a crowd like this on my ranch. This land? Well, it's seen more hard winters than good ones. A while back I'd just about given up on it. On myself too." He paused, his eyes finding hopes across the room. "Then God sent someone I didn't ask for, but exactly who I needed. She came through a snowstorm and I reckon she brought the sunlight with her. Everything she touched started to live again. This ranch, the animals, and even me." A few people chuckled softly. Hope's eyes filled with tears. Frank swallowed hard, his voice steadying. "So if you're sitting out there thinking your life's too far gone, or that God's forgotten your name, remember this place. Remember that He don't always answer with thunder. Sometimes He answers with a whisper and a knock at the door." A hush fell over the crowd. Even the children went still. He nodded toward Hope. That knock was her. After the gathering, as the sun set behind the mountains, the guests slowly departed, some leaving gifts of bread, wool, or carved trinkets on the porch. The air was filled with goodbyes and the promise of a new year. When the last wagon disappeared down the snowy trail, Hope and Frank stood alone in the yard. The world around them glowed in the orange light of the dying sun. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Hope asked quietly. Frank slipped his arm around her. "Every day. You gave me back more than a ranch, Hope. You gave me reason." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And you gave me a home." Snowflakes began to fall again, light and soft, as if the heavens themselves were blessing the land. Hope turned to face him, her eyes full of emotion. "What do you think comes next?" Frank smiled, his hand brushing a stray curl from her cheek. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." They stood there, two silhouettes in the falling snow, the rancher and his Christmas bride, the man who'd found his faith and the woman who'd brought it back to life. And above the barn door, the sign caught the last glimmer of daylight. Hope's Haven. Established Christmas 1888. That night, as the fire crackled and the stars burned bright over the Wyoming sky, Frank whispered a prayer of thanks, one not of desperation but of gratitude. For love. For redemption. And for the woman who had walked into his storm and turned it into Christmas.